NSFW crime scene cleanup crew members of Reddit, what is your most disturbing story? I heard a story of a guy who cleans up bodies from people jumping in front of trains. In this one case they found a body with no head and couldn't for the life of them find the rest of it. In the autopsy room they saw a tuft of hair coming out of where the head should be and realized he hit the train head on and his head had caved into his chest through his neck. Not a cleanup crew, but attend the scenes. An old gentleman had died in the bath. The top half of his body was all swollen and puffy, whereas his legs and lower torso and almost melted away. Essentially created a horrendous soup/casserole mix in the bath. The coroners had to sift through the bath to find his liver, which had come out. During the post-mortem autopsy his testicles were so swollen they had to prick them just to drain out all the liquid. I just hate the smell. It seems to stick on your clothes. You come back into the office and everyone can smell it on you. Not my experience, but a friend of the family who was a first responder. A teenage couple, boy and girl, were driving upwards of 100 miles per hour down a country road in Wisconsin at night. The male was driving and was wearing a seatbelt. The female was the passenger and was not wearing a seatbelt. The driver lost control and slammed into a tree. Our friend arrived first on the scene and found the teenage female had been thrown through the windshield and was in many pieces in the branches of the tree. The teenage male driver, who was seat belted in, was found nearly completely decapitated from his head to his body, with only a strip of neck flesh keeping his head attached. He had been driving so fast that the impact caused his seatbelt across his chest to nearly slice his head from his body. Edit. For those asking, this would have happened in the early 2000s in southeast Wisconsin, Kenosha or Walworth County. This was not the wreck that happened in 2013 that many of you have asked about. My dad's friend is a cop who works a rural area and loves to tell my dad about the fricked up stuff he's come across. One of them being the time he was sent to a call of a large group of people crying and coughing in an apartment. He gets there, and it's a large group of family members there cleaning up the shotgun suicide of a relative. That's when I learned that it's sometimes up to the family of the departed to clean up after the death, and it's not always people in hazmat suits. When I was in prison we would take classes like HIV/AIDS prevention, drug and alcohol substance abuse, etc. Well, there was one class where guest speakers, who were friends with the chaplain who ran the classes, would come share some pretty life-changing experiences with the group. At least that was the idea. One morning, a guy comes in, and he looks like a pretty normal dude, and he tells us as much too. Never been a drug addict, no problems with alcohol, had a family, nice job, and he was a volunteer EMT or something similar to it. He was tasked with cleaning up car crashes most of time, so not crime scenes, but some gnarly shoot a lot of time. He continues on about how on a routine call he and another guy were cleaning up a serious car wreck. Someone wrapped their truck around a tree. The guest speaker was cleaning blood out of the passenger side floorboards when his hand slipped and he face planted in a puddle of blood. He knew immediately that he had it in his mouth and all over his face. I think some might have splashed in his eye, I forget honestly. Anyway, absolute worst case scenario ensues. The driver was HIV plus or some type of hepatitis, and he in turn becomes infected. His wife then freaking leaves him. She tells the kids/family her father is gay. They harass the shoot out of this poor guy, and basically all around ruin this guy's life. Everyone in that room, in a prison mind you, knew that it could be worse. When he finished telling us that, he stuck around and answered a few questions. Not that many were asked. That was it. No feel-good stories, no happy endings. Sometimes life just freaking sucks. Edit. I'm not sure of when this happened. Early 2000s would be my guess. I was told this during 2015 and the guy had basically moved on with his life. He had to move towns and start over. This also took place down in the southern US. Interning with a forensics unit. First real crime scene. Guy found out his boyfriend was cheating on him and flew into a jealous rage. Stabbed the guy to death with the handle of a frying pan. Chased him through the house and finished him off in the bathtub, where he stabbed him an estimated 200 additional times. His head was a ruin of pulp and bone shards. The guy I was working with tasked me with digging bits of skull from the drain with tweezers. To start off, This isn't my job, but I can tell you for absolute certainty, I wouldn't ever do it. My best friend and I just happened to be lucky enough to grow up together. When we were 18 we were both about to go our separate ways. I was joining the Marines. He was attending university. However, right before my ship date he surprised me by dropping out and coming along. I wish he never had. When we got out we both seemed okay. He was his usual self. We both had hard times and confided in each other, but other than that, totally normal. One day he begged me to go see a movie with him. The Last Witch Hunter to be exact. We were both snobs for our boy Vinny D. The next morning he made us and his father breakfast, walked out to his truck, and put a hollow point .45 through his head. After the paramedics left, one of which was my current stepfather, it was now put onto someone to clean his truck. I have seen human brains before, but I've never felt them. And I'll never forget it either. Exactly like jello, some of it mixed with fragments of skull and blood splatter all over the right side of his truck. I'll never forget holding his empty head in my hands. It was harrowing. For this reason alone I could never do this job, as having personal experience is enough for me to respect those that do it. So my mom used to do cleanup for a certain teal and yellow cleaning company and was the only one certified to do hazmat. They did cleaning for the county sheriff's department and the one that stuck with her was in the back of a cruiser. They had a meth head as they described him, but he was so tweaked out of his mind he kept rubbing his face back and forth across the dividing glass and managed to wear his face off from ear to ear. I got to see the pictures of it before cleanup nearly 10 years ago and it still haunts me to this day. Okay, not my story, but my former boss's. His wife is a mortician, and he does death scene cleanup on the side as a service of the funeral home. He said the worst thing he ever did was clean up after a homeless man snuck into our industrial building, climbed up to the top of a set of seldom used stairs and passed away. These stairs and the landings were just made up of metal grating. Maybe 2 weeks later, somebody notices the rancid smell, opens the door to the stairwell, and finds the remains of the man that had liquefied and ripped down 4 stories of stairs. In Florida, bodies decomposed real quick. We are talking a good stench within 48 to 72 hours. What no one's mentioned, I don't think, is that when you walk away from that smell, it doesn't matter because it's all you can smell for days. The smell gives me anxiety, so I end up wearing so much goddamn perfume just so I can try to smell anything else, and I always end up apologizing to my co-workers and or Aristes for the remainder of the shift. Police detective here. In a rural area a guy had passed away in his yard. In July. It was 8 days before someone found him. He was partially liquefied. There were flies everywhere, and the stench was quite nasty. The knowing where this fly were before they landed on your face did not help. Had to shovel him in the bag with gas masks. FYI, liquid people are quite toxic. I was a tow truck driver and the worst are motorcycle accidents usually. I've seen some really messed up car accidents, but I've seen motorcycle accidents where the driver was spread out several dozen yards across pavement. Edit. My highest ever comment is about pavement Berger. Nice. I'm not a crew member, but I got a story. A few years back I couldn't get a hold of my brother, so my stepmom and I drove out to make sure he was okay. He lived 2 hours from me and we haven't heard from him in 2 weeks. Not uncommon for him. He did do a lot of drugs and was a very solitaire guy. I crawled in a window and I didn't smell anything nasty, just smelled like a musty old house. Anyways, got the door open and we found him in his room. He was definitely a few weeks into decaying. He was very bloated and there was blood all over the room. I didn't initially see maggots, but from the report there was a ton in him that they mistook the bullet in his head for maggots on this ray / We had to go back the next day to his house, and I found his tooth in the closet door rails on the floor. Also the house smelled horrible oddly after the body was removed. His hair was stuck to the carpet and a few maggots were on the floor. To deter anyone from suicide, he shot himself in the head and lived long enough to put the gun under his mattress, and he laid down waiting for death, getting blood all over his mattress. The bullet was a .22. I believe he realized that it was a mistake and got up to grab his phone and he fell over to the spot where I found him. Drugs are terrible. Does doing one on accident count? I used to do auto detailing in college for a car dealership. I was scrubbing the floor of a car, and no matter what I did the water kept having a red tint to it. So I pulled the seats and found about an inch of dried crusted blood and what I can only guess was brain matter / skull fragments. Turns out it was a suicide car that the dealership bought at auction. It had been detailed before being sold, but they never pulled the seats. We called the cops to confirm it was all logged and shipped the car back to auction. The dealership lost their ass on it, but wanted it as far away from their lot as possible. Hey, search and rescue personnel here. Working in Las Vegas, we see a ton of really messed up stuff. Chances are pretty high that, if we are looking for a missing person, we'll find an unrelated subject. Worst one was when we were deployed to find a female stuffed in a suitcase. After recovering the female in the suitcase, the coroner said it was the wrong female in the suitcase, and we were sent back out to find the right one. I guess I should clarify, though we aren't a cleanup crew, we are often tasked with body recovery. The coroner's office does the packaging and led us the investigation. We then solemnly carry them out. Everyone needs to come home eventually. There's someone out there who cares for them. Funny paramedic story time. So a woman calls 999. Says she thinks her father is dead. Call handler advises CPR, but caller states it is too late. Crew arrives and paramedic approaches remote house, speaks to daughter, who is upset, but advises she thinks it's too late. Paramedic enters property and finds what is effectively a skeleton in the kitchen laid on the floor. History is daughter is fairly estranged and lives overseas from her father, normally send Christmas cards, and no other communication really. After 2 years of no cards, and him not answering the phone, she flies home and finds him dead in his home. I got this tale third hand on a Bad Jobs Stories night shift chat, so cannot confirm if all details are 100% reliable, but it makes for a nice tale. A friend of mine is a cop. He just told me of a guy they found dead in his kitchen. The stove and heater were on, and he was naked. They assumed he was just cooking while naked. You know how we all do from time to time. Can't remember how long he said he was dead for. When they lifted him up to turn him around, his penis had sort of melted to the kitchen floor. As they pulled him upwards, the dangling participle stretched off the floor like a rubber band and released, slingshotting back to the body. It sounded absolutely disgusting as he described it. TLDR, melted penis stretched and slingshotted off kitchen floor. Police officer here attended a scene where a guy went to his ex's house, walked in, and murdered her as well as her mother and teenage son. It was clear from the scene that he had gone in with a rifle and shot the three, but that the son had attempted to crawl to a phone in the kitchen. He then went out to his car and grabbed his shotgun and pumped a slug through each of their heads before putting one inside his own head. The son was in high school and was well on his way to college football. His girlfriend was scheduled to also be at the house, but had last-minute issues with a family illness. My dad used to be a coroner's assistant back in the late 70s early 80s, and he has some pretty crazy stories. The one that always stuck out, and I think most responsible for his PTSD, was a car full of drunk teenagers on prom night struck by a train. He said the car ignited, and he could smell them burning. They were barely identifiable, and he had to help move their cooked bodies. These kids were about the same age as my older brothers at the time. Just hearing the story scared the shit out of me, and I have never, and will never drive drunk. Not a cleaner, but when mum died of a brain aneurysm, she was dead on the sofa for about 5 hours in front of the fire. I was the one who found her. The only way to describe that smell was cooking pork. I now cannot eat pork or cook pork for that reason, as that smell will stay with me forever. Edit. The fire was extremely close to where the sofa is. The living room was tiny and the heat was right on her. It was also a freak snowstorm at Christmas time. It was freezing cold in her old house, so it needed a lot of heat to be semi-warm. Edit 2. No, she did not cook. Edit 3. Thanks for the silver, kind stranger. I worked in CSI in Mexico. Once we went to a safe house where the police found 14 people who were tortured and executed. You could smell the iron from the entrance. Upon entering, there were 2 women with broomsticks taped to the anus and the vagina. In the upstairs bathroom, they found a woman tied to the toilet, died of dehydration. had urinated and defecated on her for days. It was evident that they also raped her and beat her before turning her into a toilet. One of the rooms had 5 shackles on the wall, and in the center a metal bucket with water. The 5 people died of hunger and from beatings. The sickest was in the backyard. In a warehouse without windows there were several bodies that had their faces and hands removed. It was like watching a horror movie, but that's the narco in these places. Excuse my bad English. I've posted this before, but I feel it's relevant here. I'm a police officer and have been on a good number of death scenes. One that sticks out in particular was a suspicious death on the top floor maintenance stairwell of a 5-story apartment building. I arrived and could smell the body from the bottom floor in the lobby. How it took this long for anyone to call in a building filled with 100 people is beyond me. I got in the elevator and began to go up, the smell getting worse with each floor. My corporal was with me, and he started to look a bit sick. The door to the 5th floor opened, and I was hit with a smell I will never forget. The poor man was laying face down on the top floor landing, just inside the doorway to the stairwell. He had been there for about 2 weeks in the middle of July in the southeastern United States. The top floor was not air conditioned as it was storage and maintenance, so it was around 100 degrees inside. The man was bloated, leaking his juices everywhere, and his skin was a necrotic black color. The juices were leaking down the stairs, dripping onto the landings of the 4th and 3rd floor. Now, this was classified as a suspicious death, so a detective had to come out to see if we could rule out homicide, just to be sure. As my corporal was currently heaving out an open window, I had the privilege of assisting the detective with rolling this bloated corpse over to inspect it for wounds. I took hold of his arm and rolled, and I felt the arm begin to separate from the body as more death juices spilled from his torso. Luckily, no obvious wounds. When body removal came even they were gagging. Again, I got to assist with moving the corpse onto the gurney. We put on full body Tyvek suits and masks to move him in case he burst. Luckily, he just leaked, but did not split down the middle. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. Turns out he had a heart attack while on the landing and nobody seemed to realize he was gone. Once he was identified I realized I met him the week before when he called in about a woman who overdosed on heroin that he came across while mowing yards for work. Woman was given Narcan and survived. Small world. I also recently had a man who committed suicide by drinking polyurethane. In case you're wondering, no, drinking polyurethane is not a painless and easy way to exit this world. Edit to clarify, I met him a week before his estimated death date. Sorry for the confusion. Geez, he cares enough about someone nodding, but nobody cared enough he was gone until his body started to smell. That's so sad. This is a third-hand account, but basically goes like this. Forensic cleaner is cleaning up a murder kitchen in a big house. The police return to the property midway through the cleanup. They silently somehow alert her to the fact that the suspect is still on the property, then make a show of leaving again but don't really. The cleaner calmly finishes off and leaves. The police find the guy in the air duct with the murder weapon. He had been watching the cleaner the whole time. I'm not a professional cleaner, but I have cleaned a murder scene before unfortunately. My best friend was to beat to death with a baseball bat in his home. It's apparently pretty expensive to have these people come out and clean, and his parents didn't have it. Trying to do what we could to help out, a few of his friends got together to clean it. I don't have anything crazier to say that I haven't already about the scene. The entire experience was extremely surreal and not something I think about often. I'd say the craziest thing would have to be the weird places we'd find a speck of blood with seemingly no logical way for it to have gotten there. Logic, of course, had left that room before we got there. Firefighter EMT here. Just had a suicide not too long ago. Guy was caught in one of those local pedo stings, like you see Chris Hansen doing. He had his sentencing moved from April to July. This is important later. Pedo guy writes a suicide note, tapes it to his door, then walks outside to his carport. Pedo guy started a 12 gauge shotgun, stuck the shotgun in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. When I got there first on scene there were droplets of blood, brain tissue, bone, and sinew dripping off the carport overhead. The top of his head was caving in, and both hemispheres of his brain were laid out, 10 feet from each other. Both parts of his brain were miraculously intact. Attached 12 lead to check for heart activity legally required to, and obviously found nothing. Walked around the dripping brain material to get to the front door and found his suicide note, which was just legal paperwork stating who was allowed in his home and who to call, etc. On the note was an original date of April 20th, and that date was crossed out, of which the current date was written next to it. See first paragraph. When crime scene cleanup arrived, he was the only person available to come, so he was alone. He stayed on scene to assist however we could, due to having a good rapport with the company. He told us that a chemical they use to clean will change the color of the blood to a greenish color if said blood contains certain pathogens such as Hep C or HIV. Lo and frickin' behold, this shoe changed color. We assisted him to move the body to his vehicle and call it fricking day. It kind of feels good to talk about it though, even if it's to faceless redditors.